Good morning, everyone. My name's Paul, and I'm an associate pastor here at Wycliffe, and I'll be bringing God's word to us later on in the service. But right now, as we're starting this new series in the book of Isaiah, before we have the Bible reading for today, which is Isaiah chapter 6, I'm just going to do a brief overview of the whole book. Isaiah is described as one of the most glorious prophets of the Old Testament, and he brings to us a collection of prophecies that speak to the nation of Israel at a time of tremendous political upheaval and unrest, not just for the nation of Israel, but for the nations around and the global empires of the time. And Isaiah is also seen as a fifth gospel because it brings a message of God's future judgment as well as salvation. And let me just talk to you about a few of the themes in the book. The first theme is really how he describes God's people as a rebellious people, like wayward children, like stubborn donkeys wanting to go their own way, rejecting God, the true God, and chasing after idols. But it also describes God's people as having blood on their hands, a society where there's no justice anymore, where there's no truth, where leaders are corrupt and the poor and the vulnerable are oppressed, and the rich are just getting richer. Does that sound familiar to us? Another theme is that Isaiah is called to announce that judgment is coming and it can't be stopped. And yet, in judgment and after judgment and through judgment, God is still with his people and there is hope. And this message is woven right the way through the book that one day God will fulfill his covenant promises by sending a king from David's line to establish God's kingdom. And that this king will lead God's people in obedience. And so God's blessing will come again to his people and flow out to the nations. And that after final judgment, God will create the new heavens and the new earth. And God will once more live amongst the people. And there will be peace with God, between man and God, and peace between the peoples and creation, and God's kingdom will be restored. And Isaiah brings this message to us with powerful stories and parables and graphic pictures that capture our heart and our imagination. And yet, Isaiah's message comes in a historical context that lasts about 200 years. And really to understand that, we just need to go back. If you remember the history of the Israel nation, there were 12 tribes that came out of Egypt, and it took a while for them before they became a single nation under a single king, the King David. And that happened in about 1000 BC. But that only lasted for 70 years. And in 930 BC, the kingdom of Israel split again into the northern 10 tribes known as Israel and the southern 2 tribes known as Judah. And really the book of Isaiah talks about a period of history in the life of Israel. And it talks about 3 main events. The first event is when Assyria is the global power and they come and conquer the northern kingdom and take them away into exile, never to be seen again. And that happens in 722 BC. And really the first section, the first 39 chapters of Isaiah really focuses on that key event. And then the next event that the book of Isaiah focuses on, chapters 39, 40, and then 55, is the next key event, which is actually the judgment that comes on Judah. The Babylonian empire takes over from the Assyrians, and the Babylonians come and conquer Judah and take them off into exile in 586 BC. And finally, the third part of the book of Isaiah, chapters 55 to 66, focus on the next main event of history, which is the return from exile of the people scattered in the Babylonian kingdom. And that happens after the Persians rise up as the global empire, take over from the Babylonians, and they allow God's people to return and rebuild Jerusalem in 539 BC. And traditionally we see that Isaiah gave his message in the 8th century, really looking forward to these 200 years of history, bringing God's word to that context, but also beyond that context to the ultimate judgment and the new heavens and the new earth. But also other scholars believe that actually Isaiah started, but then there was a school of prophets that lived and brought God's word into the context at the time of these three events. And so you have people who say that there are three books written at three different times. But whatever it is, the message is the same. God's message is brought to his people. But we're going to be focusing on chapters 6 to 12. The first 5 chapters of Isaiah are like a foreword, like a prologue, and great to read because they pick up, it gives us a taste of Isaiah's poetry and the main themes that flow through the whole book. And Isaiah 6 is about Isaiah's commissioning and the message that he's given. And the following chapters speak really with the backdrop of this context of the northern kingdoms threatening the southern kingdom, and yet the rise of the Assyrian Empire and the taking of the northern kingdom off into exile and their destruction. But let's look now at chapter 6 and let's read verse 1 together.